In the heart of Brookhaven, Georgia, where gospel hymns echo on Sunday mornings and everyone knows everyone's middle name, there lived a family that represented everything this town held sacred: faith, tradition, and moral order. Pastor Elijah Maddox wasn't just a preacher, he was the voice of Brookhaven's conscience. With a booming baritone and eyes that could both scold and soothe, Elijah had led Hope Revival Church for over 2 decades. To his flock, he was a shepherd. To outsiders, a man whose life had been divinely appointed. Beside him stood Celeste Maddox, his elegant, soft-spoken wife. Known for her grace and composure, Celeste was the kind of woman who brought casseroles to funerals, prayed at every meal, and never raised her voice. Together, they were the model of Christian family values. Their daughter, Rachel, a medical student, was the final piece in their picture-perfect puzzle. They were, by all appearances, untouchable. But perfection is a fragile illusion. Beneath the tidy pews and whitewashed chapel walls, a secret had begun to fester. A sin not whispered in prayer circles or tucked into the pages of Sunday devotionals. Celeste Maddox, the pastor's wife, was having an affair with Jaden King, a 20-year-old volunteer who once dated her daughter. What began as glances and shared silences evolved into midnight rendezvous and dangerous promises. It all came crashing down on a cold March night in 2016, in an abandoned tool shed at the edge of Willow Creek. There, one of them would die, another would lose everything, and the man at the center, Brookhaven's beloved preacher, would find that no sermon, no hymn, and no redemption could save him from what he had done. Because in this town, built on appearances and scripture, even a righteous man can fall. And when he does, he doesn't fall quietly. On the surface, the Moreno family of Ridgeview, Georgia, embodied the American dream. Reverend Caleb Moreno, with his charismatic sermons and unshakable devotion, led the Ridgeview First Baptist Church, a modest but fiercely faithful community tucked away in the Appalachian foothills. A man in his early 50s, with a silver-streaked beard and eyes that held both fire and fatigue, Caleb was revered as a spiritual father by hundreds. To his congregation, he was a shepherd, a moral compass, a man who walked with God. Beside him stood Eleanor, his wife of 28 years. Quiet, elegant, and always dressed in shades of soft blue or ivory, Eleanor had long been seen as the pillar of grace behind her husband's ministry. She hosted prayer groups, organized charity drives, and sang hymns with a voice that brought grown men to tears. But to those who looked closer, there was a stillness in her presence that bordered on sadness, a sort of permanent sigh that settled behind her smile. Their 2 children, Jacob and Lacey, completed the picture. Jacob was away at seminary school, following in his father's footsteps. Lacey, just 20, helped with Sunday school and sang beside her mother in the church choir. They were the kind of family that townspeople pointed to when talking about faith, love, and legacy. But behind closed doors, the Moreno household had grown hollow. Caleb, once tender and attentive, had become a man consumed by ministry. His schedule was a blur of hospital visits, sermons, board meetings, and counseling sessions. The man who once brought Eleanor coffee in bed now barely noticed when she cried herself to sleep. Conversations turned into calendar checks. Affection became obligation. And Eleanor? After nearly 3 decades of serving as the preacher's wife, she felt invisible. It was into this emptiness that temptation would creep. A temptation young enough to be her daughter's boyfriend. And what began as glances and polite small talk would soon spiral into betrayal, secrecy, and ultimately, bloodshed. Because beneath every perfect family portrait lies a shadow. By the fall of 2011, things had shifted in the Brooks household. Subtly at first, like shadows creeping along the edges of a well-lit room. Elijah Brooks, once the beating heart of the Stonebridge Church, had become more of a symbol than a man. Revered by his congregation, his presence in the pulpit remained powerful, his sermons stirring and commanding. But at home, he was a ghost. His days stretched into nights at the church, counseling troubled members, planning outreach programs, praying with grieving families. He was always giving, pouring from his cup until there was nothing left for Ruth. Ruth Brooks, once proud to be the wife of the town's beloved pastor, now sat alone more nights than not. The parsonage was quiet, too quiet. Dinner would go uneaten, conversations cut short, replaced with tired nods and distant smiles. Their 3 children, Sierra, Micah, and little Naomi, felt the tension but couldn't name it. They simply knew that Mom looked tired and Dad was always gone, and that's when he arrived. Deshaun Price, 19, the son of Elijah's former seminary classmate, sent to Stonebridge for a fresh start. Handsome, confident, with an effortless charm and a hunger for purpose, Deshaun was taken under Elijah's wing almost immediately. He was to assist with youth ministry, help around the church, maybe even consider seminary one day. Elijah saw him as a younger version of himself before the burdens of the cloth had settled in. But Ruth saw something else, something she hadn't felt in years. Deshaun noticed her. It began innocently. A shared laugh in the church kitchen, a compliment that lingered longer than it should, a ride home from choir practice. Harmless, or so she told herself. But the way his eyes held hers, it made her feel visible again. Like she wasn't just a vessel of sacrifice, like she was still a woman. That winter, Elijah began sleeping at the church more often, citing late-night vigils and planning retreats. Ruth stopped asking why. She already knew the answer wasn't about God. It was about escape. For both of them. By January 2012, the parsonage had become a place of whispered sins, and doors closed a moment too late. Deshaun and Ruth were now caught in the slow gravity of something neither wanted to name. It wasn't yet physical, but the emotional intimacy was undeniable. Long conversations on the back porch, shared prayers that ended with lingering glances, the kind of silence that says more than words. Ruth felt shame, yes, but also awakening. At 43, after 2 decades of dutiful marriage, the attention of a young man like Deshaun was intoxicating. It made her feel foolish and alive. Deshaun, too, wrestled with guilt. Pastor Brooks had given him everything: mentorship, a roof over his head, purpose. But Ruth was magnetic. Her elegance, her sadness, her eyes that burned with years of unsaid things. He didn't mean for the hugs to last so long. He didn't mean for his hand to brush hers that way. But he didn't pull away either. Meanwhile, Elijah remained oblivious, or perhaps willfully blind. He'd begun preparing a major sermon series on temptation in the modern age, unaware of how close that very thing had come to his doorstep. Some in the congregation noticed his tired eyes, his thinning frame, but chalked it up to divine burden. Then came the church retreat in early March. Elijah would be gone for 3 nights, leaving Deshaun behind to help manage Sunday's youth service. Ruth didn't plan anything, but plans weren't necessary anymore. Desire had its own momentum. That Saturday night, Ruth opened the door to a knock she had expected all day. Deshaun stood there, nervous but unable to turn away. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. When the door closed behind them, The last thread of pretense fell away. For the next 3 months, Ruth and Deshawn lived in the dual realities of performance and passion. At church, she was still the gracious First Lady, smiling beside Elijah, her hand folded neatly in his during benedictions. Deshawn remained the dutiful youth assistant, leading Bible studies, organizing game nights, sitting politely through Elijah's sermons on fidelity and righteousness. But behind closed doors, specifically in a weathered shack tucked deep in the pine woods just outside town, they were something else entirely. The shack was old, abandoned years ago by a logging company. Dusty windows, creaky floorboards, and a rusted roof. But it was theirs. It was a place where Ruth wasn't pastor's wife, and Deshawn wasn't the mentee. In that secret space, stripped of titles and expectations, they gave in to the ache they had tried to suppress. Yet, the walls were closing in. Elijah had grown suspicious. It was small things at first: Ruth's sudden absences, the scent of cologne that wasn't his, the nervous energy Deshawn carried in his presence. Then he found a note, half torn, stuffed beneath the couch cushions. Just a line: "Meet me where the pine bends." Elijah knew that phrase. It was a landmark, an old tree in the woods just past the creek bend near the shack. The same shack he and Ruth had picnicked near when they were young. He said nothing. He prayed instead. Prayed for clarity, for restraint. But the prayers rang hollow in his chest. On April 28th, as twilight painted the sky in bruised purple, Elijah followed the trail into the pines. A crowbar tucked beneath his coat, his heart pounding, not just with anger, but with grief, with betrayal, with the weight of everything he had sacrificed. What happened next would stain those woods forever. April 28th. The sky over Ridgeview was smeared with bruised clouds, and the scent of rain hung heavy in the air, a storm not just in weather, but in hearts. Deep within the pine woods, an old shack stood like a forgotten relic, silent and still. It had become a meeting place for stolen moments, whispered confessions, and now, confrontation. Reverend Elijah Brooks stood outside that shack, his breath shallow, fists clenched tight around a rusted crowbar. Inside, his wife Ruth was meeting Deshawn again. He had followed her. This time, he wasn't praying for strength. He was running on heartbreak, betrayal, and rage. Inside the shack, Ruth and Deshawn sat on a bench, their voices hushed, faces close. Ruth, for the first time in weeks, looked lighter, unburdened. But that moment shattered the instant Elijah kicked open the door. His silhouette filled the entrance like a ghost. His eyes, no longer the eyes of a preacher, were burning with something ancient. Deshawn stood up, stammering, "Sir, Reverend, I—" "Don't," Elijah growled, voice raw. "Don't call me that. You don't get to speak holy words in this place." Ruth's face collapsed into tears. "Elijah, please. You didn't mean to tear out my soul?" Elijah stepped forward. The crowbar dragged against the floorboards. "You didn't mean to make a fool of me? In front of my congregation? My daughter?" Deshawn tried to shield Ruth, but the boy was shaking. "It wasn't just physical. I love her." That word, love. It broke Elijah. He roared, a sound torn from a place deeper than pain. He swung the crowbar once, not at Deshawn, at the wall. Wood splintered. Ruth screamed. Elijah dropped the weapon, breathing heavily as if expelling years of devotion turned poison. "I built my life on faith," he whispered, "on God, and you two gutted it." He didn't strike again. He didn't need to. The silence that followed was far more violent. When he turned and walked out into the trees, Ruth collapsed to her knees. Deshawn stood frozen, unsure whether to follow or disappear. But nothing would be the same. The storm had broken. The next day, Ridgeview woke to a calm morning that felt wrong. It was too quiet, too still, like the town itself was holding its breath. Inside the Brooks home, Ruth sat at the edge of their bed, her hands trembling as she replayed the night before. Her heart still pounded with fear, but worse than fear was the guilt. She had broken the man she once vowed to honor. Her betrayal hadn't just scarred Elijah, it had set fire to everything they'd built. Across town, Deshaun sat in his car outside his parents' house. He hadn't slept. He couldn't eat. His hands wouldn't stop shaking. His face bore the terror of a boy who had overstepped into a man's world and now had no idea how to come back. He wanted to run. But where? Ridgeview was no longer safe. Not from Elijah. Not from the whispers. Because the whispers had begun. Neighbors talked. Church members exchanged glances. A rumor spread. Reverend Elijah had confronted his wife and her lover in the shack. That someone screamed. That something broke. Nobody knew the whole truth, but in towns like Ridgeview, truth was always secondary to drama. Elijah didn't return to church that Sunday. That silence spoke volumes. Instead, he locked himself inside his study, the same room where he once crafted sermons about grace and love. Now, those verses mocked him from the walls. He couldn't bring himself to pray. God, if he was listening, had been silent too. Detective Warren Klein had picked up the scent. A tip had come in. Someone had seen Ruth enter the woods. Another had seen Elijah leave, shaking, pale. Klein was methodical, and what he sensed wasn't just a marriage in trouble. It was a powder keg. And Elijah, he could feel it all closing in, like the walls themselves were watching. The home he once filled with joy now echoed like a tomb. His daughter Monique had stopped speaking to him. She knew something had happened. She just didn't know how deep the cut ran. And maybe that was the worst part. Not the screams or the confrontation, but the silence after. It was a group of teenagers who found him. On May 1st, they were hiking through the Ridgeview Pines, kids skipping school, chasing ghost stories. But what they found in that shack wasn't myth. It was Deshaun's body. He was slumped against the wall, eyes wide open, his face twisted in horror. Blood had dried in streaks across the floor. The smell hit first, then the silence. It was so still, so final, that none of the kids spoke. One simply pulled out their phone and dialed 911. Within the hour, Ridgeview PD had sealed off the area. Detective Klein arrived, ducked beneath the caution tape, and walked into the ruin of something sacred. The scene told him everything he needed to know. The struggle, the final moment. But it was the look on the boy's face that stayed with him. Back at the Brooks house, Ruth was mid-prayer when the knock came. It was soft, respectful, but heavy with what was behind it. Detective Klein stood on the porch, his badge visible but his expression human. Ruth opened the door and knew. Before he spoke, before he asked, before the words left his mouth. "Elijah didn't do this," she whispered. But the detective only nodded. "We still need to talk." And that's how it began. The unraveling. The truth. The silence in the interrogation room was almost unbearable. Detective Sarah Mendez sat across from Gloria, the once elegant matriarch, now hollow-eyed and visibly trembling. Days had passed since the brutal discovery of Elijah's body in the abandoned boathouse on the outskirts of Lake Mont. The community was still in shock. But Detective Mendez knew something wasn't right. Too many loose threads. Too many secrets behind the Mitchells' perfect image. "I'm not here to judge you," she said gently, watching Gloria avoid eye contact. "I just want to understand what really happened that night." Gloria finally spoke, her voice low, cracked, like she hadn't used it in years. What started as a whisper soon became a flood of words. She confessed to the affair with Elijah, how it began with innocent conversations after choir practice, how she felt seen for the first time in a decade, how the attention reignited something long dead inside her. But she hadn't expected to fall in love. Nor did she imagine that her husband, Pastor Calvin Mitchell, the revered man of Lakemont, would follow her that night. According to Gloria, Calvin had grown suspicious. He noticed the late-night texts, the sudden change in her demeanor, the avoidance. He hadn't confronted her, not yet. Instead, he followed her. And on that fateful evening, he watched as his wife embraced a man young enough to be his son. Something inside him snapped. Gloria described how Calvin stormed into the boathouse, shouting, unhinged. How Elijah tried to explain, tried to de-escalate, but was met with nothing but fury. The murder, she said, wasn't premeditated, but it was brutal. A crowbar, a scream, and then silence. Tears streamed down Gloria's face as she finished. "I should have stopped it. I should have told the truth earlier. Maybe Elijah would still be alive." Detective Mendez leaned back, absorbing every word. It wasn't just about an affair. It was about years of repression, shame, and loneliness bottled up inside a marriage that looked perfect from the outside. The mask had finally cracked, and beneath it was a tragedy no prayer could absolve. The morning of April 14th, 2017, was overcast in Lakemont. Clouds hung heavy over the town like a prophecy fulfilled. When the officers arrived at the Mitchell residence, there was no resistance. Pastor Calvin Mitchell was already waiting in his study, sitting alone with a Bible unopened on the desk before him. His hands rested flat, palms down, as if bracing for judgment. He didn't ask why they were there. He didn't deny the charges. He simply said, "I suppose it was bound to happen." The arrest sent shockwaves through the town. A man who had baptized their children, led their funerals, counseled their marriages, was now in handcuffs, charged with second-degree murder. News vans parked outside the church. Congregation members wept openly. Some refused to believe it. Others whispered that they had always seen cracks in the Mitchells' polished armor. The trial began 6 weeks later and unfolded like a Southern Gothic novel written in blood. The courtroom was packed every day. Former parishioners sat in stunned silence as the prosecution revealed the depth of the scandal. Photos of the crime scene, the murder weapon, testimonies from Gloria. Even text messages between Gloria and Elijah were displayed on the screen, each word feeling more damning than the last. A jury watched as the facade of the perfect family shattered in real time. Calvin's defense tried to plead emotional duress, that he'd acted in a moment of spiritual collapse, driven by betrayal and humiliation, that his entire life had been built on discipline, duty, and denial, and the discovery of the affair was like a divine betrayal. But the prosecution pressed harder. Is that what a man of God does? Beat a boy to death because he can't control his rage? Gloria's testimony was the dagger in the heart. When she stood on the witness stand, her voice barely audible, she described how Calvin's violence wasn't new, only finally visible. How years of silence had bred desperation. "I don't excuse what I did," she said through tears. "But I never thought it would end like this." When the verdict came down, guilty of second-degree murder, the courtroom exhaled. Calvin lowered his head. Life in prison. No possibility of parole for 25 years. But justice, if you could call it that, had not come without cost. the church was closed within weeks. Families stopped attending Sunday services. The building stood empty, a rotting monument to faith undone by secrets. The fall of the Mitchell family echoed through Lakemont for years after the trial ended. The once proud brick church on Willow Lane, where Calvin had preached for more than 2 decades, was eventually boarded up, its stained glass windows dulled by dust and neglect. Some said the building still carried his voice in the rafters, like a ghost that refused to be exorcised. Others simply crossed the street to avoid it, like passing a graveyard of misplaced faith. Gloria Mitchell never returned to the pulpit. After the verdict, she moved out of state, quietly, without fanfare, leaving behind her daughters, who had already begun to rebuild their lives in separate directions. Rumors whispered that Gloria had checked herself into a Christian recovery center in Virginia. Others believed she had disappeared completely, vanishing beneath a new name and a lifetime of shame. But perhaps most haunting was the legacy left in the hearts of the people who had once believed in the Mitchells. Congregants who had raised their children under Calvin's sermons now questioned everything. The scripture he had preached about redemption, love, and divine order now felt like hypocrisy carved in stone. Was it ever real? Or had they been following a man who was breaking long before anyone noticed? Terrell's family never truly recovered. His mother, a gentlewoman named Lorraine, kept her son's bedroom untouched for years, still smelling faintly of his cologne, with textbooks stacked neatly by his bed. A single photo of him and Gloria, taken at a youth retreat, sat in the center of the dresser. Lorraine never spoke ill of Gloria. "She was just lost," she once told a neighbor, "but my boy, he deserved better." As for Calvin, he spent his days in a medium-security prison in northern Alabama. Word had it, he ran a Bible study for other inmates, an irony not lost on anyone. Whether he saw it as penance or self-preservation was anyone's guess. But every night, when the lights dimmed and the cell doors locked, Calvin was alone. Not just behind bars, but inside the crumbling cathedral of his own mind. In the end, the Mitchell family wasn't destroyed by one affair, one mistake, or even one murder. It was undone by a lifetime of silence, by years of unspoken loneliness, unmet needs, and a religion too proud to admit it was broken. And that, perhaps, is the true tragedy, that a man who preached about healing others never learned how to heal himself. That a woman who smiled for every Sunday service was quietly falling apart behind closed doors. And that a community, so desperate for perfect families, never saw the storm brewing until it was far too late. Because sometimes, the most dangerous lies are the ones we tell ourselves.